Nobody ever asked Elliott Marsh how he was doing and actually meant it. Not his colleagues, not his neighbors, not even the people who shared his dinner table on the rare occasions he allowed himself to be around others. And Elliott never corrected them. He had learned, somewhere along the way, that the honest answer to that question took too long to give. And by the time he finished, whoever had asked would have moved on to something else entirely. So he learned to say fine. He learned to say good. Thanks. He learned to keep the rest of it locked somewhere behind his eyes, where it spun and churned and circled back on itself like a current with no shore to break against. Elliott was 32 years old. He worked in data analysis for a mid-sized logistics company in a city that was large enough to feel anonymous, but small enough that he sometimes ran into the same strangers twice. He lived alone in an apartment on the 6th floor of a building with a faulty elevator, which meant he climbed stairs every morning and every night. And sometimes he was grateful for that small mechanical resistance, because it was the only thing that asked anything physical of him. His body at least had to work. His body didn't overthink. His mind was a different matter entirely. It had started long before he could name it. As a child, he had been the kind of boy who lay awake rehearsing conversations before they happened. Not because he was afraid of them, not exactly, but because he could not tolerate the feeling of being unprepared. He used to practice what he would say to his teacher if she called on him in class. Even for subjects he understood, he would rehearse the exact tone and the exact words, because the right word said in the wrong tone could mean something entirely different. And he had noticed early that people rarely said what they meant, which meant you had to think about what they actually meant. And then you had to think about what your response would mean to them. And then you had to think about what they would think your response meant. And by the time the actual conversation happened, Elliott had already lived through 17 versions of it, and was exhausted by the one that was actually occurring. Most people thought he was calm. His composure read as confidence to those who didn't know him well, which was almost everyone. He had a steady voice and a habit of pausing before he spoke that made him seem thoughtful. And he was thoughtful. That was the problem. He was so deeply, relentlessly thoughtful that the thinking never stopped. Not during meetings, not during meals, not during the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning, when the rest of the city seemed to finally exhale and go quiet, and Elliott lay in his bed with his eyes open and his mind moving at a speed he couldn't slow. The week it all began to accelerate started on a Tuesday. Elliott had arrived at work 11 minutes early, as he always did, because arriving on time felt presumptuous to him, as though he were assuming the world would be ready for him exactly when he planned for it to be, and the world, in his experience, was never quite that cooperative. He had gotten coffee from the machine in the break room, had taken a seat, had opened his laptop, and had begun the work preparing a quarterly report that wasn't due for another 8 days. He had started it early because starting it early meant he would have time to review it, and reviewing it meant he could catch errors. And catching errors mattered because errors meant questions, and questions meant attention, and attention meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant the possibility of being found lacking in some way he hadn't yet accounted for. His manager, a pleasant and distracted man named Daniel, had stopped by his desk around 10 in the morning. He had said something casual and vague. He had said, "Good work on the Miller account, Elliott. We'll talk more later." And then he had walked away, coffee in hand, already looking at his phone. Elliott had said thank you. He had smiled. He had watched Daniel disappear around the corner. And then he had sat completely still for 47 seconds while his brain began to work. We'll talk more later. What did that mean? It had sounded positive. Good work. That was positive. But we'll talk more later. That was not a conclusion. That was a setup. You didn't say we'll talk more later after a purely positive observation. You said great job and moved on. We'll talk more later meant there was something else. Something that hadn't been said yet. Something being saved for a different moment. A more private moment. A moment when other people wouldn't be around to hear it. Elliott opened the Miller account files and read through them again. He had read them the night before. He had read them the week before. He knew the numbers the way a pianist knows a piece of music. Not just the notes, but the spaces between them. He could not find an error. He could not find anything that warranted a conversation. But that didn't mean there wasn't something. That just meant he hadn't found it yet. And if he hadn't found it, maybe that was a problem. Maybe the problem was that he was missing something he should have been able to see. And that invisible gap between what he had produced and what he should have produced was exactly what Daniel was going to tell him about later. By noon, he had reconstructed the entire exchange 17 times. By 2 in the afternoon, he had begun to wonder whether good work had been said with a particular emphasis, whether the word good was being used in contrast to great, whether it was a softened compliment designed to lower the blow of whatever was coming next. By 4 o'clock, he had written and deleted a follow-up email to Daniel 3 times. By the time he left the office, he had convinced himself that the conversation scheduled for later was something to be dreaded, even though no conversation had actually been scheduled, and even though Daniel had said good work, and even though nothing objective had changed since the morning except the accumulation of his own interpretations. He climbed the stairs to his apartment. He made dinner. He sat at the table and did not taste any of it. This was the pattern of Elliott Marsh's life. Not a dramatic unraveling, not a visible crisis, but a slow and steady consumption of his own present moment by a future he was constantly, compulsively constructing. He lived several steps ahead of himself at all times, and the Elliott who existed in those imagined futures was almost never doing well. He was being confronted or misunderstood or caught off guard by something he should have prepared for. He was failing quietly, in ways no one else could see, in rooms that hadn't happened yet. There was a phrase that appeared in his mind with a frequency that would have alarmed someone had they been able to hear it. The phrase was, what if? It appeared before he sent emails. It appeared before he made phone calls. It appeared at the grocery store when he chose one brand of pasta over another. Because what if the other one had been better? And what if he should have known that? And what if his choice said something about him that he hadn't meant to say? It appeared at night when he tried to sleep, because what if he couldn't sleep? And what if not sleeping meant he would be slow tomorrow? And what if being slow tomorrow meant he missed something? And what if that something mattered? And what if the whole careful structure of professional reputation began to crack from that single hairline fracture of an inadequate Tuesday? He had spoken to a doctor about it once, years ago. She had used the word anxiety in a clinical, matter-of-fact way that had somehow made it feel both more real and less serious at the same time. She had suggested some things. He had tried some of them. They had helped a little, in the way that a glass of water helps when you're not sure whether what you are feeling is hunger or thirst. It addresses one possibility without quite reaching the other. He had not gone back, not because the appointment had been bad, but because going back would mean continuing to examine something he had decided on some level he could manage on his own. And Elliott was good at managing. He had managed for 32 years. He had a job and an apartment and a functioning life by any external measure. He just happened to also have a mind that treated every neutral moment as a potential emergency. The problem was that managing had a cost, and that cost was compounding. And Elliott was starting to feel in ways he couldn't precisely articulate. He stopped going to the gym around this time. Not decisively. He didn't cancel his membership, didn't make any formal announcement to himself that this was ending. He simply started finding reasons not to go. It was too late, or too early, or he was too tired from work, or he had something he needed to review before tomorrow. Exercise had always been one of the few things that quieted his mind, because it was purely physical and demanded only that his body perform, not that his brain anticipate. But now the thought of going required energy he couldn't locate, because the energy that should have been available for living was being spent on thinking about living, and there wasn't enough for both. He also stopped returning calls from his friend Marcus, whom he had known since university and who checked in every few weeks with a reliably warm and uncomplicated kind of friendship. Marcus never required anything complicated from Elliott. He asked about work. He talked about his kids. He made Elliott laugh, sometimes in ways that felt like breathing after being underwater. But answering the phone meant talking, and talking meant being present. And being present meant not being able to control the direction of the conversation. And uncontrolled conversations had an unpredictable quality that Elliott had begun to find genuinely exhausting. So the calls went to voicemail, and then the voicemails went unlistened to, and the silence between them stretched. It was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the Daniel incident, which had resolved itself within 48 hours in the most anticlimactic way possible. Daniel had simply wanted to tell him that the company was thinking about expanding the data team and wondered if Elliott would be interested in taking on a mentorship role when something shifted. Elliott couldn't point to a specific moment, It wasn't a trigger in any obvious sense. He had just come home from work, had climbed his stairs, had stood in his kitchen, and had realized that he couldn't remember what he'd done between leaving the office and arriving at his door. He had walked 15 minutes through a city that was alive and moving and full of specific sensory detail, and he had not been there for any of it. He had been somewhere else entirely. He had been inside his own head, in a room with no windows and no exits, running through the implications of conversation he'd had that afternoon that had seemed unremarkable to everyone else involved. He stood in his kitchen and felt something close to vertigo, not the physical kind, not a spinning or a stumbling, but a disorientation that was more fundamental than that. He felt like he was standing on the outside of his own life, watching it happen behind glass, separated from the actual texture by a pane he couldn't break through. He sat down. He sat in his kitchen chair, and he put his hands flat on the table, and he looked at them. They were his hands. He knew they were his hands, but they felt like a detail he was observing rather than a part of himself he was inhabiting. He thought, I have been thinking for so long that I have forgotten how to simply be. And then he thought about that thought. And then he thought about the thinking about the thought. And the spiral deepened. The nights grew harder. Elliott had always been a light sleeper, but now sleep was becoming genuinely elusive in a way that felt different from anything that had come before. He would lie down and close his eyes, and his mind would begin its inventory. Everything he had said that day, everything he should have said, everything he might need to say tomorrow, every possible response to every possible version of tomorrow's events. He had started keeping a notepad on his bedside table to write things down, because he had read somewhere that writing things down helped, that it took the pressure off the brain to hold everything, that externalizing a thought could reduce its power. But what happened instead was that he filled pages and pages with items that felt urgent at midnight and trivial at 6 in the morning. And the writing itself became something he needed to do perfectly, because if he missed something, if he forgot to write it down, it might slip away and come back later at the worst possible moment. He was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Not because he wasn't sleeping enough, though some nights he wasn't, but because rest requires more than closed eyes. Rest requires a mind that is willing to release its grip, even briefly, on the work of anticipating. Elliott's mind had forgotten how to let go. It had been gripping for so long that it had lost the capacity to unclench. It was a Friday night in late October when it happened in full. He had come home to an empty apartment, as he always did. He had made dinner, had sat at his table, had looked out the window at the lights of the city arranging themselves against the dark sky. And something in that view, the distance of it, the way it made the city look organized and purposeful and entirely indifferent to him, had set something loose. He thought about his job. He thought about the quarterly report, which he had submitted 2 days early and which contained no errors that he had found, but which might contain errors he hadn't found, and which was now in Daniel's hands, and which he could no longer revise. He thought about Marcus, who had stopped calling. He thought about the gym membership he was paying for and not using. He thought about the doctor he hadn't returned to. He thought about every decision he had made in the last 3 years, and whether they had been the right ones, and whether the life he had constructed around himself was a life he would have chosen if he had been able to see it clearly from the outside. He thought about who he had been before he had been this tired. He thought about whether that person still existed somewhere inside the one who now sat alone at a table with cold food in front of him on a Friday night, thinking himself into paralysis. And then the thoughts stopped being sequential. They had always been sequential before. Even when there were too many of them, they followed each other in a chain, one pulling the next, cause and effect and implication and counter-argument, a long line of dominoes that he could at least trace back to the beginning. But now they came all at once. Every version of every fear arrived simultaneously, without order or hierarchy, without a single one taking priority over any other. The conversation with Daniel and the missed calls from Marcus and the unread voicemails and the empty gym and the notepad full of midnight writing, and the image of himself standing in his kitchen, not recognizing his own hands, and the vertigo behind the glass, all to collapse into a single moment of overwhelming, simultaneous presence. And Elliott found he could not think through it, because thinking required sequence, and there was no sequence left, only wait. He sat in the chair, and he did not move. He did not cry, because the feeling was not grief. Exactly. It was closer to saturation. It was a feeling of a container that had been filled so many times, in so many small increments, over so many years, that it finally had no more room. There was no dramatic breaking. There was no sound. There was only Elliott, sitting in the dark of his apartment, fully still for the first time in longer than he could remember, because there was nothing left to do but stop. He stayed that way for a long time. When he finally got up, he didn't make a decision exactly, but something in him had shifted. Not a resolution, not a plan, but a crack. A thin line of light through something that had been sealed. He found the card the doctor had given him years ago, still in the back of his wallet, soft with age. He set it on the kitchen counter. He did not call that night. He wasn't ready. But leaving it there felt like the beginning of something, like setting a stone in a direction, even if you haven't yet taken the first step. He slept that night in a way he hadn't slept in months. Not peacefully, not without interruption, but differently, as though his mind, having finally run itself all the way down to empty, had temporarily lost the energy to manufacture new fears. The silence it left behind was strange and unfamiliar and a little frightening in its own way, but it was silence. And silence, he realized, was something he had been running from for so long that he had forgotten it was survivable. The following Monday, he called Marcus. He didn't explain the silence. He just said, "Hey, I know it's been a while." And Marcus said, "Yeah, it has." And neither of them made it anything more than that, which was exactly what Elliott needed. He also called the doctor's office. He made an appointment. He didn't cancel it. He didn't fix anything in a week or a month. Minds that have been wound tight for decades don't uncoil overnight. And Elliott knew better than anyone that the work was long and unlinear, and that there would be nights when the thoughts came back in their old formation, marching in sequence toward catastrophes that never arrived. There would be weeks when the thinking outpaced the living again. There would be mornings when he stood in his kitchen and felt the glass between himself and the world and couldn't find the door through it. But something had changed in the texture of his relationship with all of it. He had seen the bottom. He had sat in the full weight of everything his mind had been carrying all at once, without escape, and he had not dissolved. He was still there when the saturation passed. And being still there on the other side of it gave him something he hadn't had before, not certainty, not peace, but a faint and stubborn evidence that the silence after the storm was real, that it existed, that it was available to him, even if he had to lose everything first to find it. Nobody knew what had been going on inside his head. Not Daniel, who had only ever seen a composed and capable analyst who submitted reports 2 days early. Not his neighbors, who nodded at him in the stairwell and thought nothing more. Not even Marcus, who had known him for years and loved him in the easy, uncomplicated way of old friends who don't ask too many questions because they trust you to tell them when it matters. Nobody knew that had been part of the problem. And maybe that was a thing worth saying. The thing at the center of all of it, that the most dangerous place a person can disappear into is a place that looks, from the outside, like total composure. That the quietest voices are not always the calmest ones. That the man who always seems fine is sometimes the one drowning in plain sight, in a room full of people, with no one in the world close enough to notice that the water is already at his chin. Elliott Marsh had been drowning for years. He had been so good at it that no one had seen. And the most terrifying thing about almost being lost is how ordinary the outside of it looks. How a man can sit at his desk and submit reports early and say, "Fine, thanks, good," and be, at the very same time, entirely alone inside a mind that never, not once, let him rest. The light on the counter blinked. The card sat there. The phone rang once, and then he answered it. And for the first time in a very long time, Elliott Marsh decided to stop thinking about what came next and simply begin.